this is Tina Reynolds, and I'm with Uptown Studios, and we're doing a video series that's called Black Stories That White People Need to Hear. I'm here with Faye Kennedy, a member of the Sacramento community that I think, do you understand why we're doing this? It's like, I think that the way that I relate to this is like, it's my coming out story. When I came out, and many of my communities started coming out, and it kind of changed the way people saw LGBTQI people. Everybody knew somebody, and then when you know somebody, I become closer to them. And Faye, I think that the idea behind these Black stories is that I want to hear your story and learn from it, because the stories that you're going to tell haven't happened to me. So we're going to build some empathy with the audience. And so if you would just start with your story, and I'm here to listen.
So my name is Faye Kennedy, and I've lived in Sacramento since 1963. And there was a reason why I came to Sacramento. Originally, my parents came from the Deep South, and they were part of the Great Migration, one of the waves of the Great Migration. And they selected Sacramento for a particular reason. Both of my parents are from the rural South. I was actually born at home, and I have the honor of actually sleeping in the bed that I was conceived and born in. So I have that really good honor. And one of the reasons my parents wanted to leave the South was because of the racism and the oppression. And if you know anything about history, what was happening in the late 50s and the 60s, there were lots of killings and bombings. And so what really frightened my parents and a lot of people was the bombing of the church in Birmingham. And so my father worked for the federal government at the time. He worked at a local Air Force base, and it was closing. And so they saw this as an opportunity to get the hell out of Dodge, so to speak. So it was my parents, my mother and father, and I have an older sister. Both my parents and my older sister, all three are deceased. And so they saw this as an opportunity to leave the South. And they selected Sacramento because of Sac State and UC Davis. Back South, you didn't have universities and state colleges that the everyday person could attend. And so when we moved here, initially we lived for about a year in the Oak Park area. And moving to Sacramento was the first time I had ever attended integrated schools. So I'm 65 years old. So I can remember growing up back south seeing the colored white signs. That was just a part of everyday living. I can remember getting on the bus. You had to get on the front of the bus, put your money in, your dime or your nickel in, exit the bus, and then re-enter the bus at the back of the bus. So people tend to think that that happened a long time ago. That didn't happen a long time ago. I'm here. I can remember that. And so we didn't experience that type of racism when we came to Sacramento, but we did experience it. But our quality of life did improve. Most of the Sacramento has a large community from Mobile. Most of the folks initially moved to North Sacramento, Del Paso Heights, North Highlands, Strawberry Manor. We were some of the first families to move what we would call now South Sacramento area. And so as more people moved to Sacramento, my family, my parents, and my sister and I, we would welcome them and everything. And so I grew up in South Sacramento. I went to local schools. The elementary school I attended was Ethel Phillips, which is on the outskirts of what people would call Oak Park, the Fruit Ridge area. That probably was my first experience being in a more diverse community. So back south, you just had two groups of people. You had people who were Black or Negroes or colored. Then you would have people who were white, and in that you would throw in people who were Jewish. And then you had a large Native American indigenous community. So my neighbors who I thought were Native Americans were really Latinos or Mexican Americans. I had never seen or engaged with Mexican Americans before. That has since changed. Now the South has a large Latino community and everything. So growing up in Sacramento, I grew up in a very sheltered life, so to speak. I grew up in a small neighborhood called Freeport, where we knew everyone. It was working class. It was diverse. You had folks who were Black, a large ethnic population, ethnic minorities, which included ethnic Italians, sometimes first generation or second generation, large Latino community. We had some folks who were Filipina living in the community. But we faced a lot of discrimination when we left our communities to go to school. So I went to San Brannan, which if people are familiar with Sacramento, San Brannan is in at that time, a predominantly white middle-class community. Then I attended Kennedy High School. I attended high school with Cornell West and his brothers and sisters. And if you know anything about Kennedy High School, at that time, it was probably 3 or 4 years old. It was located literally in the middle of Green Haven. So we were met not always with a lot of love. And so I got a lot of love from my parents and the community in which I lived in and everything. So went to local colleges here, grew up here, got involved with several different organizations, helped found several different organizations. And even though I wasn't born in Sacramento, I think of Sacramento as my adopted home and everything. So Sacramento's been good to me.
So, and what about discrimination here? Did you have any run-ins with the police, or have you had anything along the lines of the topic of the day that you would like?
Yes and no. Discrimination in Sacramento and in most places outside of the Deep South, it's a little bit more subtle. Back south, you heard the N-word. You heard people referring to adult male and females as boy, gal. You don't necessarily hear that outside of the Deep South, but it's much more subtle. I experienced it particularly in high school when you see when you're treated differently. So a group of Black kids in high school could be standing around, laughing and talking. Probably our volume wasn't any differently than our white peers, but we were considered loud and boisterous. When Black folks congregate, it makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable. And so sometimes neighbors, if we're outside of our neighborhood, would look at us, would call the police. You know, there's a bunch of so-and-so, standing around. So it's much more subtle. Probably the most unique experience I've had definitely with law enforcement. I used to work in Yuba City, Marysville for a local nonprofit. One of my coworkers was home recuperating from surgery. I had just finished an appointment not far from where she lived, and I decided to just swing by to see how she was feeling. Her car was in the driveway. I knocked on the door. She didn't answer, so I kind of became kind of concerned. So I went to the front window, kind of like looked in to make sure everything was okay, knocked on the door again, didn't hear her. And I said, oh, okay, so maybe she's taking a nap, got in my car, proceeded to leave, and out of nowhere, till this day, I don't know where these police came from. One pulled up in front of me and one pulled up in back of me. And luckily I had some business cards on me. They were more interested in my business card than my ID, because the agency that I worked for was very familiar within this community. Everyone knew about blah, blah, blah. So once I showed them that, along with my ID, they felt a little bit more comfortable. I get back to my office. By the time I got back to my office, my coworker arrived home. I guess one of her neighbors told her what happened. She was mortified. And I said, well, you were mortified. I was afraid as the bejesus because I didn't know if I was going to get out of this encounter alive. So thank God for those business cards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how is it today? How is it today when you are out and about?
For me, it's probably not as bad because you see I have a little frost on my hair. I'm a little bit older. So people are not as verbally or physically aggressive with me. But having said that, there has been times when I felt a little uncomfortable, and I just, I try not to, even though people say they try not to put themselves in situations like that. When you're Black in America, or when you're brown in America, or when you're a person that's perceived as a minority in America, your life is always at risk. And I think for a lot of people who are not a person of color, or a person who's not a minority, it's hard for you to understand that a simple traffic stop could totally go wrong. So it's just being more aware of your surroundings, making sure you have your ID on you. But you can have all of that on you. You can do all the right things and still be a statistic. And so that's how I look at it.
How do you teach me how to be better? Because if I go to coffee with you, and somebody said something, I would want to stand up and defend you.
Yeah.
Where is it? How do I help lift the burden, the weight of a lifetime?
Well, I think with non-people of color have to understand the history of America. The history of America is very racist, it's very sexist, and it's very classist. And what white people don't understand is that they may not have to deal with the issue of race, but you have to deal with the issue of sexism. We're very homophobic as a society, and we're very classist. So if you can't relate about the racism part, try to look at it from the perspective of being how homophobic we are, or how we only view one religion, which is a Christian religion, not understanding that, you have a variety of people practicing all kinds of faith. So I always try to tell people to look at it from that perspective. But it exists. The difference between people of color is that our parents have to have the conversation with us probably at a much earlier age than most. I think most white parents feel comfortable talking about it. And if you, like my parents who came from the deep South, you really had to have that conversation. So we lived in Mobile, which is comparable to Sacramento or any metropolitan city. But both of my parents always wanted my sister and I to be connected to our relatives that lived in the rural South. So every major holiday, weekends, they would pack us up and we would go visit our grandparents and our relatives who live on farms. So once we left Mobile and got maybe 25 miles outside of Mobile, you could not stop to go to the restroom. You could not go into stores. You couldn't do anything like that. So you just had to, we knew when we were going to visit relatives, my sister and I knew what to pack. We would get our little potties. You just know that. That may not make any sense to you, but we knew that. That was part of the conversation our parents had. So we knew that we couldn't ask, could we stop there for water, or could we stop there to go to the bathroom? Mm-hmm. You couldn't do that. It would be putting everyone's life at risk. and everything.
So, do you have children and grandchildren now?
No grandchildren. I have a stepdaughter, and we've had to have that conversation with her, particularly when she went off to college. She left Sacramento to go to San Jose State, and it's a conversation, whether it's with your biological children, whether it's with your neighborhood children, whether it's with your nieces and nephews. You either have that conversation directly or you have that conversation indirectly. Indirectly sometimes may be in a group setting, directly may be one-on-one. You have that conversation. You know, you talk about what to do if you're engaged with law enforcement. You talk about, you keep your hands up. You talk about, watching your voice tone, different things that you wouldn't even think about. You do that. Well, I think it's ironic. I'm in my second marriage. My first husband was actually a police officer. And so even he saw people were treated differently based on their race, class. In this country, you're treated differently based on how you look and what your zip code is. Mm-hmm. And I think people wanted to, if there's anything that's good that's come out of the recent deaths of folks, is that we're having a national as well as a communal conversation about how my life is in relationship to how your life is, and then your life, it may be different from other people. And I think that that's the beginning. That's the beginning step.
So the thing that that really hits my heart is that I have children and grandchildren, and I've never had to have the conversation. Now I have two grandchildren that are mixed race, and they are Black, and conversations need to be had. And yes. I need to be taught. It didn't happen in my life. I could go anywhere I wanted until I started wearing my bow tie, and then I've had, it's like you said, I've had a lot of homophobia around my life, mm-hmm. and mm-hmm. I've learned from it that it's not necessarily as easy for me as it is for someone else.
Right.
But right. It's still, I feel like it's still easier for me than it is for you. And, mm-hmm. Right. I could pass if I wanted to. I just choose not to.
Right.
Right. Right. Well, maybe I couldn't pass. So, maybe I could never pass. But
right. So the big thing is there are tools for you, depending on your age group of your grandchildren. So PBS has done at least 2 series about how to talk to children about race and racism. CNN has done things like that, and there's several books. But I think even before parents or the adults can have that conversation with children or teenagers, even, is that you have to question your own self as an individual about the biases that you may have. Whether it's based on skin color, whether it's based on race, whether it's based on religion. People have to have those internal conversations. And then once you are grounded or centered in that, then you can have those conversations, because even though children, a 3-year-old can pick up on that you're lying to them. They know when grandma or grandpa or auntie is not being straight up with them. They may not ever say anything, but the teenagers definitely will say, like, they'll call you out, like, come on, you're not being honest, or you hear people say, I don't see color. Like, I'm like, saying, how could you not see color? Or people will say that, or they say that they're colorblind. And I'm like, okay, because those are signals to me that they have not worked out their own issues.
Yeah. So how do you bring up these? What are some of the things that people should be careful to say now? I think that it is like, for me, people say, well, what should I call you? You should ask me, and I'll tell you. It's like, I prefer right. she, and I prefer she, but I'm called sir more than her. Right. So, but I'm okay with that. And it's like, so what do you prefer to be called?
Sure. So for me, I view myself as a Black American, a person of African descent, and I think when you get to know people, you just ask them, what do you prefer? Do you prefer to be called African American or blah blah blah? And there's some political reasons why I don't necessarily use the term African Americans, because people think about African Americans as only as Black Americans living in the United States, but African Americans, if you really do the research, refers to people living in both America and South America of African descent. But when we say Black Americans, that encompasses both people who are African American that live in this country as well as others. That's my comfort level. Other people don't feel comfortable with that. It's like when I do writing, even though I know grammatically you would never capitalize the word Black American, but I do. I do. So I think. Yeah, go ahead.
What's the next conversation that we need to have? How do we? Next. What's next?
What's next is that people. I think before we can move to the next conversation about anything, the person has to get centered themselves. The person has to realize what they're uncomfortable with. And then whatever they're uncomfortable with, they have to ask themselves, why are they uncomfortable with that? So, and it may be something really serious, or it may be something like, okay, so let me give you an example. Bless her heart, my sister is now deceased. My sister was literally would panic around people who we would call little people. She would call them midgets. And I would tell her, I said, you don't call people midgets. That's inappropriate. I would say calling them a midget is equal to using the N-word. But she would just become so afraid that she would lose all kinds of sensibility. Until this day, I don't know why she would just be so uncomfortable. But so she could never engage little people or people who were short in stature in a comfortable way, because she was just too afraid. She was just too afraid.
Yeah. I'm going to let Kiara into the room. All right. Kiara
great.
Is joining us. Hi, everyone. Kiara Reed has joined the room, and I just wanted to introduce her. She is my compadre in this effort, and she's my guiding light. It is easy to go wrong on a discussion like this, and I just want to listen. I want to hear stories, and I want to ask questions how we can be better. Kiara, it's on you.
Yes, Faye, I'm wondering, there's been a lot of talk about how folks can be better allies. And so I'm wondering how you feel about that, and what do you think, especially people who aren't Black, how do they enter that role? What does that role look like?
Sure. So I think to be an ally or a friend to any person, no matter what their ethnic group is or what their sexual orientation is, as I was mentioning to Tina, the person has to be somewhat grounded or centered themselves. And then they have to understand America's history, because America is very racist, is very classist, is very homophobic. And so it's actually moving to be more xenophobic. So I think if you understand that, and then you have to, one of the things that I think people don't oftentimes realize, that America doesn't portray Black and brown people with a lot of humanity. So if you don't view people with humanity, you don't realize that they need support or they need the love. And I think that's why I say people have to get centered themselves. And once you get centered yourself, then you're able to reach out and provide the love and support. So I'm going to give you an example. I have a friend who's African American, who was adopted by a white family. And I actually got to know her father first. But he never said that he had a Black adopted daughter. He just said, "Oh, you remind me a lot of your daughter, my daughter." So, okay. And that whenever there was a crisis, her brothers and sisters would always call in and check with her. You know, so like if the Rodney King incident, they called in and they checked in with her, you know, or whatever. There was a really good support. And I think sometimes people don't realize it's the small things, but it's also the big things. And I was pleasantly surprised when I finally got a chance to meet her that in many ways we looked alike. And I think that's why he thought because she was a little short. She had sandy colored hair. She had a little round face like I had. And her father in particular was a minister, but he made every effort to make sure she was connected to the Black community. So even though she knew about Jack and Jill, she knew about sororities, she was connected. And her family worked together to connect her and everything. And I think friends have to see the humanity in me as an individual, and with that encompasses to be a good support and a good ally.
Thank you.
Thank you. Faye, thank you so much for sharing your story. We will have this out. I'll share a link with you. And if you have friends that have stories, please reach out to Kiara or myself because we want this to grow. We really do want to share stories and help people to learn. People like me need to learn about people like you. And that's what this is all about. And I send you away with all the love I can send to you, and hopefully this will help lift the burden that you have just a little bit. Thank you for being.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.